There are several Rust quizzes online, including one that's literally called the Unfair Rust Quiz at This Quiz is Fucking Gay, but when I was given the opportunity to record an episode of the self-directed research podcast live on the main stage of Eurorust 2025, I thought I'd come up with something special. I thought I would test James's knowledge of Rust, letting him play against an audience of hundreds who would be able to answer quiz questions live from the comfort of their phones. I quickly discovered that the domain name what.rs was available, but I forced myself to go through this project in a very specific order so as not to let it die due to dopamine exhaustion. The most important part of a quiz is the content. At first I reached out on Mastodon and Blue Sky asking for cursed trivia about Rust and Cargo to get me started, and even though I learned a lot, none of those facts were really suitable for inclusion in a quiz. I wanted the questions to teach something to the average viewer, even if they got everything wrong, so I wanted to start with simple optimizations, like turning divisions by 2 into shifts. But while working on that part of the quiz, I accidentally discovered the following. Division by 5 is optimized to this monstrosity, which is amazing and scary. To check what some code optimizes to, I ran it through Compiler Explorer, and I always had to translate the assembly back into Rust. On stage, I actually wore a Compiler Explorer t-shirt under my hoodie. I showed it to the audience in the middle of the recording like a trophy. I originally wanted to test other backends like GCC and CraneLift, but I ran out of time. Also, this would have required multiple answer support, which I decided not to include in this version. I spent days on Compiler Explorer trying to find interesting compiles. I found that the funniest questions were some that I had to build up to, right? This innocent looking thing clearly works, so does that one. Then we make just one more tiny change and it breaks everything. A good example is this series of floating point arithmetic questions. X divided by 1 optimizes to x. Also, x divided by 1 divided by 0 optimizes to x divided by 0. However, x divided by 3 divided by 0 does not optimize to x divided by 0. I would not find the explanation for this one, or several of the memcopy ones, until later playtesting sessions. I collected all the questions in a big spreadsheet, sorting them into categories like trivia, arithmetic, undefined behavior, dead code elimination, constant folding, loops, etc. And once I was convinced that I had enough quality questions to fill a 30-minute session, I decided to start building the software I would need for this. I know there's plenty of already available quality presentation and live quizzing software, but I knew exactly what I wanted, and I figured it was a good opportunity to evaluate Rust front-end frameworks. I'd heard a lot of good about Dioxys, and the developer experience via their DX tool, which is clever naming, turned out to be very smooth, which was all the convincing I needed. I had a couple of false starts. For example, I was very curious about Dioxys Live View a la Phoenix, but it turns out that it's in a state of relative disrepair and that Dioxys full stack is the way to go instead. Instead of using a stable Dioxys version, I immediately turned to a release candidate to take advantage of sub-second. It took me a week to realize that I forgot to turn sub-second on, since it requires passing --hot patch to the CLI. When enabled, it is indeed very fast, but also very crashy, just like the release notes warned about. Without hot patching, this left me in the unpleasant situation of having to batch code changes, wait several seconds for a recompile, then switch back to the browser, click around to restore the application state, and see the result of my changes, which is a far cry from the experience of building, for example, a Svelte 5 app, where Vite is able to compile and hot reload changes in well under a second, preserving state whenever possible. But what I lost in iteration speed, I gained in compile time confidence. Since I had already built an entire CMS in Rust, I was able to reuse my experience there, like using pull down CMark for markdown parsing, or tree sitter highlighting for syntax highlighting. My first idea was to hard code all the slides to avoid over-engineering, but I quickly discovered how important it was to be able to iterate on the questions and the design of the slides. So I added a reload button and made up a format for the slides, a single markdown document where each slide is separated by 3 dashes. Slides with a question have numbered lists with checkboxes, a la get a flavored markdown to-do lists, and the correct answer is checked. By the way, did you know you don't need to have the numbers be sequential in a numbered list in Markdown? You can just have them all be 1 and it's going to number them properly. After getting the very basic rendering working, I did some very brief styling. I was wondering how I would get the text to be big enough on large screens, and my answer was the simple and efficient font size set to 3 viewport widths divided by 100. I don't think anybody should do this, by the way, and it makes for weird behavior when zooming in and out of the browser, but it did the trick. So unlike regular presentation software, here all the state is kept on the server, right? I join as a host and create a room, and then that room starts on a particular slide. When a player joins a room, votes on a question, or when the host goes to the next slide or previous slide, the entire state of the room is broadcast to everyone, host and players. Of course, it would be a lot more efficient to only send send a diff of the state to send only what's changed, but I didn't have time to make sure this would work reliably, and I figured Rust is efficient enough for the naive approach. I added like the minimum amount of security, but just enough to feel at peace going to the conference. For example, you can only join as a host if you know the hard-coded password. Player names cannot be picked manually, they are generated at random from a list of adjectives and animal names, and room identifiers, which are 4-letter codes, are filtered for profanity to avoid showing 4-letter words on stage. Now, I did accidentally say fuck in the middle of the presentation, and I don't know how they handled that because they had a live stream going on, so I'm so sorry to the organizers of Eurorust 2025. I didn't mean to, it just kind of slipped out. I wanted to be able to go back to the previous slide to discuss it, but that opened the question of when should a slide be open for votes, right? Otherwise you can just cheat. And the answer I came up with is if you're navigating to a slide and it still has 0 votes, then it's fine, it's open. This worked beautifully in all the playtests with up to 50 people in the room, and then on the day of, I navigated forwards, one person managed to sneak in a vote, and then I navigated back, and that logged that question for everyone else. That made multiple people disappointed, and it was the main piece of feedback I got after the presentation. When the application started working well enough for me to test it, I wrote a Docker file for it. I tried to follow the best practices showcased in the Diaxis documentation and all around the web, use multiple stages, use Cargo Chef to pre-build dependencies. As far as I can tell, that advice is no good, especially with Diaxis, which uses its own target directory, so I don't think it's been benefiting from any of the work Cargo Chef is doing ahead of time. Also, dxbuild is wonderful, but it insists on reinstalling wasm opt, wasm bindgen, etc., even if they're already in path. I ended up getting rid of Cargo Chef and just using a cache mount, which ended up being a lot faster for me when running builds locally. I already have a Kubernetes cluster running for my website, so I deployed the app there. Deploying applications to it has become sort of mindless, which is actually nice and somewhat reliable. As I deployed it, I also finally grabbed the domain name what.rs via the Istanco registry. It's less than 25 euros per year for all your Rusty needs if you want a .rs domain. And then I was ready to do the first couple of playtests. My friends Aurora and Lucas went first in one-on-one video calls, and although they didn't find any major issues with the quiz itself, I got the chance to make some of the questions clearer and more technically accurate. This was the last night before leaving for the conference, and I started getting nervous about whether the game would scale to hundreds of players. So I decided to set up a load test, but I didn't want the test to be synthetic. I didn't want to just fire up 500 WebSockets and see if the server stayed alive. I wanted to test it with humans. The problem is I didn't want to spoil anything for anyone. I needed to come up with the second quiz. I took a bunch of questions that were left over from the spreadsheet, but it wasn't enough, so I started reading all documented error messages from the Rust compiler one by one to find interesting questions, and I finally ended up running that test quiz at 10 p.m. my time on twitch.tv/fasterthanlime with Luke Vester as a co-host because it's more fun with a co-host. We got about 40 players consistently, along with a lot of arguments in chat, but overall we all had a lot of fun and everything worked fine. The night before Eurorust 2025 in Paris, I joined a Rust meetup. I gave a talk about Diaxis, and I asked the organizers if I could run the test quiz after dinner. Waffle agreed to join me to co-host that quiz, thanks Waffle. Ollie walked on stage to explain some stuff to everyone. It was so popular that it started fights in the audience between different Rust project contributors. Like, this shouldn't work like this. Like, I don't remember us deciding that it should work like this. It was a blast. I also learned that just because something is rejected by Miri doesn't mean that it's actually Ubi. And it helped find some bugs that when the phones went to sleep and then woke up again, people got reconnected as a new player ID, so they lost their scores and the player count just went up. On the first day of the conference, I solved the reconnection and ghost player issue, but most importantly, I made it possible for the host to reconnect. Can you imagine if I accidentally reloaded the page in the middle of the presentation and then everyone just lost their points? I also added QR code generation so that people in the audience could join the room before the talk even started by scanning the screen. Mara was kind enough to run through another playtest with me and got me the explanation for that one, the divided by 3 does not optimize away. The idea here is that 0 divided by 0 is not a number. And x might be non-zero, but small enough that dividing it by 3 will be rounded down to 0, and that's why we cannot actually optimize out the first division by 3. Amanu did the second playtesting session with me and stayed up late thinking about this. Is this mem copy? He came back to me the next morning victorious. It's because of LLVM optimization pass order. The mem copy recognition pass runs after the remove useless assignments pass, so this one doesn't optimize to mem copy. I spent the second day of the conference entirely working on either the software for the quiz or the contents of the quiz. I wasn't happy with the generated animal names. I would have loved to know who actually placed well in the quiz, so I added login with GitHub, figuring out that people wouldn't have the time to make a fake GitHub account with profanity in in it, and they would just want to use their own GitHub account for glory if they got a good score. I came up with the dirtiest OAuth 2 implementation you can think of and stored profile information client-side. So all of it could be spoofed, but as far as I can tell, nobody spoofed it. So good job on being well behaved, everyone. I added some quality of life stuff, like if you don't use the QR code and you're just entering the room code, then as soon as you enter the 4th character, it joins automatically. Before I did that, some room codes would get auto-corrected by the browser to something else. Now, I know what you're thinking, there's an autocorrect attribute, you can just say to false. Not in Diaxis, it's not in the typings, so you can disable autocomplete, but not autocorrect. So, yeah. On the first day of the conference, when we recorded the first episode of SDR and James was hosting, we didn't have a remote or a clicker to be able to advance to the next slide. So I figured on the second day, I would just use my phone as a remote, which required me to add the ability to join an existing room as a host and to add gesture detection on the client side so that I could swipe on my phone to move between slides. My main concern at this point was still connection stability, or what happens when the player's phones go to sleep. I noticed that Diaxis 070 release candidate 1 had come out a couple days prior and advertised automatic reconnection of WebSockets. So on the day of, I spent a couple hours porting everything over to the new release candidate. And I don't know exactly what they mean by automatic reconnection. It's possible that it does work, but in my testing, it wasn't enough. So at the last minute, I added some logic to reload the page after getting some WebSocket errors, or if pinging didn't result in a pong within a few seconds. And the last deployment of the website, which on the conference Wi-Fi took probably 5 to 6 minutes, happened 40 minutes before James and I had to walk on stage. And I was honestly pretty anxious, right? If it fails on stage, if there are too many people joining, if anyone DOSes the server, then all of that will have been for nothing. But everything went absolutely fine and everyone had a lot of fun. I was asked whether I would make the quizzing software open source for Rust meetups and whatnot, and the answer is, why not? I would like to improve it first, a little bit, and then I'll consider open sourcing it. I hadn't presented on stage for a few years, and Paris was a positive experience for me, so after getting home, I reached out to other conferences to see if they would be interested in having such a quiz, and I'm happy to announce that I will be giving a quiz at Rust Lab 2025 in Florence, Italy, from November 2 to November 4th. That's how long the conference lasts. That's not how long the quiz lasts. I'm on November 4th. It's not too late to buy tickets for it, so if you want to go on an impulsive trip to Italy, I will see you there for another test of your Rust skills. Thank you to everyone who helped make this quiz a success, all the playtesters, the Twitch chat, everyone. You and James, my co-host, of course, the developers of Diaxis. I've been rough on you, but that's only because I had to code all this in anger. Thank you to the organizers of Eurorust 2025 for inviting us. It was really nice to have like 2 occasions to record the podcast on the main stage, and it was really nice. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.